Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening, and welcome to the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C.'s Foreign Policy Panel discussion on formulating a new security environment, the U.S. engagement in the Middle East. I am Heidi Shoup, and as President of the World Affairs Council, it is my pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. I will note from the beginning that our use of the term Middle East tonight is not meant to confuse anyone. We are, in fact, using the term to identify the region roughly from the Arabian Peninsula and Persian Gulf to the frontier between Pakistan and India. In a sense, the term Middle East in this context more closely aligns to the old British term, which would have included India, of course, and represented that part of the world that was then referred to as the place between the Near East and the Far East. But tonight we simply use the term as a way to focus on that area in which the United States has been engaged in 2 wars for nearly a decade, without any real conclusion or resolution yet in sight. Tonight we wanted to step back and take a look at U.S. engagement with a bit more of a holistic approach, and to do so we have asked our 3 speakers to address some of the relevant issues at what I will term the level of the forest rather than the level of the individual trees. Dr. Robert Hunter, a senior advisor at RAND, has long been on the front line of American diplomacy and foreign policy crafting and implementation. A former U.S. ambassador to NATO under President Clinton, Dr. Hunter was principal architect of the new NATO following the demise of the Soviet Union. He has served as a member of the Defense Policy Board, director of Western European and later Middle East Affairs on the National Security Council, and was principal author of the Carter Doctrine on the Persian Gulf. Earlier in his career, he served on the White House staff under Lyndon Johnson. He is author of numerous books and articles on defense, national security, and foreign policy issues. His newest book is entitled Building Security in the Persian Gulf. Tonight, he will focus on Iran, Iraq, and U.S. response to asymmetrical threats. Matthew Ho made headlines in the fall of 2009 when, as the senior U.S. civilian in the Zabul province in Afghanistan, he became the first U.S. official known to resign in protest over the Afghan policy, which he had come to believe was simply counterproductive. He is director of the Afghan Study Group at the Center for International Policy here in Washington, D.C. As a Marine officer and a State Department official, he served in Iraq and Afghanistan and was involved in both combat as well as reconstruction and governance issues. He will focus his remarks on Iraq and Afghanistan. Steve Clemons is the director of the American Strategy Program at the New America Foundation. His extensive Washington experience includes tenure as executive director of the Nixon Center for Peace and Freedom, and on Capitol Hill, where he served as Senator Jeff Bingham's senior policy advisor on economic and international affairs. He has a well-known blog, The Washington Note, which focuses on foreign policy issues as well. Tonight, he will talk with us on the economic implications and feasibility of the current course and the economic sustainability of various forward strategies suggested this evening. Following their remarks, our panelists will take questions from the audience. I will just remind you to wait for the microphone to be brought to you so that our audience at home will be able to hear your questions. Now, please join me in welcoming our distinguished panelists. Let's start with you.
Well, I guess I go first. Thank you, Heidi, for that very complimentary introduction for the 3 of us. It's an honor to be here with the World Affairs Council, which sets such an extraordinarily high standard, not just for the ideas it promotes, but for the public education and engagement of people in the Washington, D.C. area, as it does nationwide. We're talking about the Middle East tonight, and one thing I'm going to take a little bit of exception already. I don't think we can just start with the area of the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Peninsula and move eastward. I think we're going to have to start with the Levant, all the way at the Mediterranean, all the way to the Hindu Kush and beyond into India. First, I have to tell you about how skilled and accomplished I am. When I first got into this business a long time ago, I decided to get in because there was an item in the Sermon on the Mount, at least the version that I read, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall never be unemployed. Just to tell you, I've been working on Arab-Israeli affairs off and on for 43 years, and Persian Gulf affairs off and on for 41 years, and still haven't managed to get it right. So maybe my two colleagues will tonight. But that helps to underscore what's going on. This, I won't say, is one of the most intractable areas of the world, but it's certainly one of the most neuralgic and one of the most difficult for us to comprehend and come to terms with and to be effective with regard to. And let me just start with three basic propositions. Number one, in this area we are talking about, the United States will have no choice but to be deeply engaged for as long as any of in this room are living and breathing. The idea of the United States somehow reaching a conclusion in this region and then being able to diminish our engagement, as we are now finding in Europe or in areas that were dominated by the old Cold War, it's not going to happen. And if there was any reason for us to have that re-emphasized, not just by the conflict we got into after 9/11 in Afghanistan, but by the American invasion of Iraq in 2003, at the end of which I said to a number of people, I said, whether you like this war or not, it sealed our fate in terms of responsibility to put something back in place of the security system that was then shattered. And I also said to our European allies, many of which didn't like what we were doing, largely incidentally because they were afraid we would end up exactly where we did and it would distract their attention from things they cared about. I said, you also have no choice but to be engaged. It's going to be a long time coming, and frankly, I don't see the end of it. But what's the worry? The worry is, I think, twofold. Number one, the price of engagement, certainly in blood and in treasure. We have now spent variously on the two wars we're engaged in, somewhere between, you're the economist, you tell me, somewhere upwards of $2 trillion, and if you look at all the associated costs, a good deal more than that, and there is no end in sight. But on top of which, there are extraordinary opportunity costs. The time, effort, attention, resources we put into this region, beginning with the two wars and other concerns, necessarily detract from other things we would like to do in the world, and also things we'd like to do at home. The price in terms of our domestic development is real. The price in terms of what some people think is the focus of the 21st century, whether it's India or China or someplace other than Europe and other than the Middle East, that price is real. And that leads to a question about whether we can find some alternative means of meeting our continuing responsibilities, and yes, our continuing interests in a less difficult way. Another concern that comes across right away is that we have a tendency in this country, superb tacticians, to look at problems as though they have some kind of individual significance to be resolved or dealt with on their own. I would hazard the following, that between the Levant and India, we do not have 7 separate issues or 8 separate issues that happen to connect with one another. We have one issue. We have one overall framework, holistic. Our chairwoman said this morning, said just now, and I think absolutely correct. It's one overarching requirement and strategic perspective with a number of different parts, one part connected to another. But that's the way it is. They are connected to one another. And just to give you one example, right now we are talking a lot about Arab-Israeli peacemaking, and I suspect we'll hear some questions and comments about it, because that tends to be an issue of significant moment for us. But I will hazard the following. It will not be possible to do anything significant about Israeli relations with the Palestinians as long as we continue to have the problems that there are with Iran. No Israeli government is going to be able to make any agreement of any substance with any Palestinian leadership so long as the Iranian issue is out there as currently defined. They are utterly connected to one another. I would also argue, since I've already introduced the idea of Iran, that if we are to try to prevail and be successful in Afghanistan, it is certainly going to be facilitated if we could find a way in which we could return to the relationship we had with Iran between 9/11 and the enunciation in the presidential State of the Union the following January, that Iran was part of the axis of evil. Iran helped us with the overthrow of the Taliban, not because they love us, but because they're number 2 on the al-Qaeda hit list and number 2 on the Taliban hit list. But we just right now have no capacity to deal with them. Now, so that's my second point. We have to look at this strategically and the way they work together. But the third point is that if we are not going to be consumed by this with all the distractions and the high costs, both in blood and treasure, we need to start thinking of something else. And I would argue that what we need to try to look at is some kind of new form of security structure for the region, particularly the region around the Persian Gulf. Right now, there isn't one. Yes, there's a security system. There always is. But in terms of structure, whatever there was shattered. And I would argue that we need to get on with the business of trying to build something which will, over time, if it would work, enable the United States to secure its interests and other objectives at lower cost, blood, treasure, and opportunity costs. But among other things, that means a process of working with other countries to a degree that we talk about all the time, that unfortunately we do too little. One of the lessons I think that we learned from the invasion of Iraq is that the experiment in going alone failed. We all now understand, beginning in the late Bush administration, understanding now it's important for the United States to work with others, but it's also, I think, in regard to the Middle East, not just working with others if we can do it, but to find some kind of structures that have some kind of capacity to work. Number one, who's in it? Right now, it appears that we might be able to work with most countries in the region of the Persian Gulf, but not Iran. But I would argue that if we just see it as an effort to confront Iran over time, we're going to find ourselves bearing all the burdens for as far as our head can be seen. But at least leave it an open chair and see if there are things in which Iran might see a self-interest itself in meeting our fundamental requirements that we have now, which have to do with the nuclear issue, but also some other issues, but from which it can gain something as well. That, incidentally, in my judgment, we could debate this, would require us taking a different perspective with regard to Iran, including on the process of negotiation. We say we are willing to negotiate with Iran, but we're not willing to talk with them about their security requirements. I mean, heck, we did that with regard to the Soviet Union. The Cold War came to an end only when the Soviet Union and the United States started taking responsibility for one another's fundamental security. But we're not prepared to say that with regard to Iran. If you want to do that, we're going to have them as an enemy. Is there an alternative to that? I'm not sure. We haven't tried it. There are a number of things I think one needs to do. Number one, starting with Iraq, to create political and military cooperation that's not just between us and Iraq, but that involves other regional countries. Secondly, to try to work on some of the confidence-building measures that we applied elsewhere in the world. I would start with a few right now. Number one, confidence building in cooperation on something that every regional country cares about, which is counter-piracy. Counter-piracy. Even the Iranians have a ship down off Somalia and cares about it, but we don't have any coordinated way of doing it. Regard another confidence-building measure, freedom of shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, which every country has an interest in, every country. Another confidence-building measure would be an incidents at sea agreement between us and the littoral countries, including Iran. We did that with the Soviet Union in 1972. We ought to be reaching out to Iran and seeing whether they would do it with us because it's in their common interest. Obviously, we have to deal with the issue of a possible Iranian bomb. I'm arguing that if we were to open the dialogue far broader, we might have a better chance of succeeding, because right now I don't see a chance of success. If Iran decides to go forward or not, maybe in its sovereign decision, but what we are doing now is unlikely to prevail. Sanctions almost never work, and we may find ourselves with the invidious choice of either making war or accepting an Iranian bomb. I don't want to live in either world. I don't want to live in either one. Sarkozy, the president of France, said that there are two unacceptable things, one an Iranian bomb, the other is a war with Iran. But there are possibilities of trying other things that might actually have the collateral benefit of a potential role with, in Iran and working in the broader framework. There are other possibilities. The Organization of the Islamic Conference actually has a very powerful counterterrorism agreement. And every country except Israel belongs to the Organization of the Islamic Conference. Now, it has a big gap in its definition of terrorism, which is liberation movements, especially against Israel, are accepted. You can do whatever you want. But if you close that loophole, there's actually a good precedent there. And countries doing some things for themselves in terms of security. Well, I'll conclude with, even if we are able to move in this direction, we'd have to start by saying it is something we would like to do to reduce our burdens and increase what others will do in trying to create a system from which everybody can gain something. Yes, we're going to continue to have to be involved. There are going to have to be some kind of security guarantees from outside. They can be from the United States. They can be from other countries. But the more you have a security system that has some capacity to work on its own in the region, the less likely it is the United States is going to be called upon to have to discharge those final guaranteed responsibilities. Will this happen? I cannot predict that it will. Right now, we're not even pointing in that direction. But I would argue that if the United States doesn't want to be stuck ad infinitum with the responsibilities for security in the region, in our interest, we need to get on with something like I have been suggesting here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Appreciate everyone coming out on a cold January night. Want to thank World Affairs Council for having me here and for allowing me to sit at this platform with really two great gentlemen. Full disclosure, Steve Clemons founded the Afghanistan Study Group, which I direct, so he's technically my boss. So you're probably not going to see a lot of disagreement on my part with what he says.
Though I could always disagree with what he said.
And then, oh, great. I am the director of the Afghanistan Study Group. We're a network of 60 foreign policy practitioners, experts, academics, who in August published and then released in September a document, the Afghanistan Study Group Report, which you can find on afghanistanstudygroup.org, and there are some copies out front on the registration desk. That basically organization or network that came together and said, we disagree with where the United States is heading in Afghanistan and in the region. And what I'd like to do is share with you our fundamental disagreements with the current policy, current path we're on in Afghanistan, as well as briefly go over our recommendations for Afghanistan, and then talk a little bit about how I see this applying to what we're currently doing in Pakistan and how we should be trying to address issues with Pakistan in a way that's not going to put us in the same spot we are today in Afghanistan with regards to Pakistan. So, as I said, we have 60 different members of the Afghanistan Study Group. And one of the nice things that's occurred over the last couple of months is that where we've put our position out back in early fall with regards to a policy towards or policy shift for the United States and Afghanistan, it's now been followed up by many different organizations. The Council of Foreign Relations, Center for American Progress, Center for New American Security, I believe a Center for Advanced Defense Studies is putting one out soon, International Institute for Strategic Studies, have all put out similar reports that, while they're not exact, are within that 80% bracket of the current policy the United States has undertaken in Afghanistan is excessive in its costs. It is not having an effect on al-Qaeda in its operations worldwide. And the policy itself with regards to Afghanistan is not just failing, but is counterproductive. And we need to find a new approach that is much more rooted in political efforts than in military. One of the things about the Afghan Study Group is that we are 60 different individuals who are in this, coming from different walks of life, different parts of the country, different sides of the political spectrum. And there are different reasons that unite us in our push for, a different policy in Afghanistan. Excuse me. The first is cost. And this we find to be the thing that resonates most with the American public on the Afghan war. The projected cost for the United States in Afghanistan, according to the Congressional Research Service, for FY 2011 will be $119 billion. That comes out to $325 million a day. Last month, the city of Camden, New Jersey had to lay off 400 firefighters, cops, and other municipal employees because of a budget deficit of $26 million. We go through $26 million in a matter of hours in Afghanistan. So we find the cost argument or the factor of cost plays into a lot of people's thinking with regards to our policy in Afghanistan, in the sense it comes down to a standard cost-benefit decision, in a sense of what are we putting in and what are we getting out. The second one is that we're not having a real effect on al-Qaeda. It's true al-Qaeda needed safe havens in the Sudan and then in Afghanistan in the 90s to build and grow into the organization that it became. But they don't need that any longer. They're a near virtual organization that operates around the world through small cells or individuals. Their spiritual leaderships in Pakistan. But even if we were to put 100,000 troops in Pakistan, we would probably not affect al-Qaeda in any meaningful way. If anything, we would play to their message of occupying another Muslim country and calling for jihad against the West to defend the Muslim lands. So many of us see us not having this effect on al-Qaeda, the presence of 100,000 troops in Afghanistan at a cost of over $100 billion a year. The next is that the policy is counterproductive. We've seen the Taliban's strength grow from 2,000 in 2005 to nearly 40,000 now. Their estimates are between 25,000 and 40,000 Taliban in Afghanistan now. And that's with a five-fold increase of NATO forces since 2005 in Afghanistan. We've also seen nothing but support for the Karzai government diminish. In addition, across the border in Pakistan over the last 5 years, you've seen tremendous instability occur. You've seen really the creation of a Pashtun insurgency in Pakistan and the creation of the Pakistani Taliban, let alone this alliance now that exists in some way between the Pakistani Taliban and more extreme groups. So we find the policy to be counterproductive. It's just not working. There's no evidence to the contrary except for proclamations of progress by the administration and by general officers that it's working. But there's no evidence of progress in terms of metrics, data points, trends, just what's occurring on the ground. This takes away from all the things you just heard the ambassador speak about. We have many less diplomats working on now because we've got so many focusing on Afghanistan, a landlocked country with a GDP of $14 billion. All these other issues, as well as issues outside of the broader Middle East, whether it be China or North Korea, or issues pertaining to South America, we're not paying attention to it as we should because of our attention on Afghanistan. And for our competitors, and I'll steal one of Steve's more favorite comments, this is good for our competitors around the world. There's nothing more than the Chinese or the Russians like to see than the United States stuck in Middle Eastern nations. It also plays exactly into al-Qaeda's propaganda campaign. And if you go and you Google it, you can see a line from Osama bin Laden in 2004. It says, all you need to do is send 2 mujahideen to either side of the planet with jihad written on flags, and the American generals will race to chase them and bankrupt their country. So it plays into, it distracts us from our purposes, and it plays into our competitors' or our adversaries' goals as well. And then finally, there's a moral component to this. that many people find important, although it certainly doesn't factor into any of the quantitative models that we're so fond of using, in our country to determine things. Is it right for American servicemen and women to die on behalf of a corrupt and predatory regime that is, by its very definition, a kleptocracy? It's a very simple question, and it's something that if we ever have a monument to this war, and if this monument has the names of the 499 Americans that were killed there this year, or the 9 that have been killed so far this month, will 15, 20 years from now, when we look at these things, think this was the right thing to do, in strictly just a moral sense? Okay? So those are the things that unite us in terms of our disagreement with the current policy. I'll go briefly into our recommendations. And as I said, we have copies of our report out front, so I don't want to belabor this, and I want to get into the conversation with everyone here as well. But basically, our recommendations, and these are to be done in parallel. We have not in sequence, but in parallel. One is political reconciliation. And several of us, or many of us, were saying this last year. There were several people who have been saying this since 2001. They've been ignored. But it is that this conflict at its core goes back to the 70s. This is not an issue. This is not a conflict that is about al-Qaeda and the United States. This is an issue of a war that has been, I would trace it back to the 1973 overthrow of the king, and that the country has been mired in conflict since then. So you have issues at local, provincial, and national levels that must be addressed, and the only way to do that is through a political settlement, through power-sharing agreements, and through a return to some type of political order in the country. The next one is a drawdown. We find that, and this is backed up by the American intelligence community, the vast majority of Taliban fight the Americans because they're Americans and because they're in their valleys and villages. This has been known for quite some time. Clearly stated in the Boston Globe in September of 2009. That 9 out of 10 Taliban are fighting us because they're occupied. So we see ourselves as a catalyst for the insurgency. The idea being remove ourselves from those places where we are causing the insurgency. We're not saying completely withdraw. We're not saying abandon, but pull ourselves out of those areas of the country where we are inciting people to support the Taliban. The third is to return to an emphasis on al-Qaeda. We style ourselves as al-Qaeda hawks, and we should go after al-Qaeda, but we should go after al-Qaeda as they exist and not as how we want them to be or as they existed in 2001. And there are examples of this over and over again. Just recently, they arrested 5 men in Sweden and Denmark, I believe, for their role in the Mumbai attacks in 2008. Only 2 of those men had ever been to the region, I believe. So we have to attack the organization and its affiliates as they exist and not as they are. The fourth is redoing our development work. We've spent $50 billion there, and we have not seen one area where the conflict has diminished because of those development dollars. So we are obviously not using that money correctly. And the fifth is a regional settlement. As Ambassador referred to, we have to bring Iran into things, but also, too, you have to have some degree of commitment by Afghanistan's neighbors to not interfere, not to sabotage the peace process, and to agree to some degree of neutrality within Afghanistan if Afghanistan has any chance of stability. Now, how does this relate to Pakistan? I would argue that right now we're at a predefining moment in terms of Pakistan and what our nation does. And we can look at Afghanistan and take away two key models that didn't work. One was the first model of ignoring it, or not being fully vested in it, or not understanding the conflict, or imposing a central government that was overly centralized and too heavily invested in an executive that only inflamed rifts within the country as opposed to healed them. Okay? The other one is this model that we're currently under of doing too much, of not understanding the source of the tension in the country, not understanding the issues within the country. We have people who will claim there are no ethnic issues within Afghanistan, that it's not a problem that only 3% of the Afghan National Army are composed of Southern Pashtuns. We have people in our government who will argue that. that it's not an issue, because what we are doing are bringing in Western democratic secular institutions where issues of ethnicity and sectarianism no longer hold any sway. Okay, so we have to be very careful as we move forward in Pakistan what approach we're going to take with regards to Pakistan. I would say too there are two things I'd like to talk about as well. You know, because we're here in Washington D.C., you guys are the World Affairs Council. You're obviously interested in how the U.S. government operates and facilitates around the world. And I'll end off with briefly. Ambassador again brought up an issue about what tools we use and everything else. And there are two things on the macro level. Two things, one on the macro level, one on the micro level, that we really have to discuss and really have to take a real look at in terms of how our government conducts foreign policy. One is very simply the fact that the dividing line for our Central Command and our Pacific Command runs through where? Kashmir. We don't even have a process at our national levels to deal with the issue of Kashmir. We don't have the right tools in place to put a solution in, let alone the fact that if you do bring up the word Kashmir, you're immediately kind of pushed out of the room. The second one is at the micro level. How are we recruiting people to go into these positions? How are we recruiting people into state, into USAID, into the intelligence community? And one of the things I noted today, I saw an announcement go out for a foreign affairs position over at State on the Afghan desk. And the biggest qualification in there was not time in the region, not speaking the language, not studying of relevant information. It was the most important thing, it seemed to me, was 12 semester hours of statistics. To be in a position to deal with the greatest foreign policy challenge for the United States right now. You know, a country that has been riven in war for 3+ decades, centuries of instability and stability, many different cultures, many different languages, religions and ethnicities completely different than us. But statistics are what's important, because we do things in a secular, quantitative manner. So I think we have a very, very real problem in how we manage our foreign policy, how we direct it, as well as who is implementing it as well, in the sense of are we bringing in the right people. So again, I appreciate you all having me here, and I look forward to your questions. I'll turn it over to Steve.
Thank you. First of all, it's a great pleasure here to be with all of you, with the World Affairs Council of Washington, and to hang out with my good friends Ambassador Bob Hunter and Matt Ho. I was asked to talk about the costs of some of this, but I'm going to weave it slightly different, because I did create the Afghanistan study group. Today we put out a release that talked about the cost of the war, and we did a survey of people who identify as conservative voters and people who identify as Tea Party affiliated members. I wanted to know what they thought about foreign policy. Maybe some of you were the people we talked to, I don't know. But I had read a CNN poll that disturbed me that showed that both Tea Party affiliated voters and conservatives largely supported the Afghanistan war. Well, when you went through and I looked at the questions they had, there was no context. There was no context. People have been largely buffered in the United States from the costs of the war. We don't have a draft. There is no, when we were in the first Gulf War, when the first President Bush went to the war, there was a huge debate in this country about who would pay for that war, what the costs of the war would be. It turned out to be rather convenient that the Japanese had a very hard time overcoming what they thought was both their own aversion to deploying forces abroad, but Article 9 of the Constitution, because they wrote a $13 billion check. We actually made a $500 million profit on the first Gulf War. But there was a concern at least about balancing and being cognizant of at least the financial costs of the war. What's interesting today when you think about security and you think about the figure that in a country like Afghanistan, which has a GDP of $14 billion, I'll say that again, it's $14 billion. It was on PBS NewsHour one night recently, and I mentioned that. I said our fiscal year 2011 expenditure will be about $119 billion. It's not just 1 year. It's risen very rapidly from about a $30 billion a year expenditure to where we're at now. It will continue to rise with the deployments. But when you look at that level of cost, Jim Lehrer looked at me and said, that can't be true. I mean, he essentially did a double take. And of course it is true. And I think many people have not been aware of that. When conservative voters were told about the high cost of the war, they didn't necessarily, the war had not been worth it, but they wanted to pivot right away. There's a sense that America's at a point where hard choices need to be made. What's interesting to me is I actually don't think financial cost of the war is the issue at all. I commissioned the report, but for me the cost is cost in the perception of American power and the cost in America's ability to affect and change the international system in ways that other nations respect or fear. I tell people the biggest national security challenge of the United States today is for the United States to be able to articulate a plan and do it and accomplish it. There's a sense of doubt about America's ability to achieve anything it sets out to do today. And that is our big national security deficit in my view at the moment. It used to be that what you did yesterday was pretty much what was going to inform what you do tomorrow. But this is one of those pivot points in history where a lot of things need to be recreated, a lot of wires need to be redone. America needs to reinvent, in my view, its global social contract with other nations. And so when you talk about the costs of an Afghanistan war, you think about the financial costs. You may think about the costs in lives of American men and women or lives on the other side of it. But what about the geostrategic costs? I would tell you that one of the unexpected costs of invading Iraq was that we created the Iran problem. Now, I don't often think about that. Iran would not be the problem today if Saddam Hussein or some, it may be immoral and impolitic to say so, but Iraq was the cork in the bottle on Iran. And to take out Iraq actually emboldened Iran and basically opened up an incredible set of opportunities. And I agree entirely with Bob that the Israel-Palestine quagmire is absolutely connected to Iran. There have been efforts to talk about decoupling. We may want to debate that later. But there's an interconnectedness of these things. And the United States right now is facing a world where, as Barack Obama said quite eloquently and I think powerfully during the campaign, he talked about the interconnectedness of these issues and how you needed to move simultaneously on them. There was no silver bullet any longer in these areas. And I basically believe this. When you're a superpower, as the United States I think used to be, it is a great power today, but I think the dimensions of superpower ness, if you put it that way, are diminishing significantly or have diminished. When you're a superpower, you get a premium on what you can do. You can, to the rest of the world, it appears that the superpower has no limits. I used to go around the world and ask people in India or Indonesia or Malaysia how they thought about themselves. Well, it's interesting, it used to be uniform almost anywhere in the world. Or you go to Europe. Bob was our ambassador to NATO, and you go to European countries. Developed or developing, other nations around the world during America's heyday were always very cognizant of their own limits and looked at the United States jealously with admiration but also irritation at how it seemed that we had nothing that could ever stop us, that there was no boundary or border, economic or military, to what the United States could set out to achieve. And I would argue that that mystique about America's superpower status was shattered at first during the Iraq invasion, but subsequently it's been shattered on many fronts. Superpowers deploy themselves in the world in four ways: economically, militarily, morally, and through ideas and institutions. Economically, we managed to pull a China to some degree. We managed to export toxic financial products to the rest of the world in our own financial crisis. And we actually undermined our ability to play a global leader in what we're supposed to be the best at in the world, which is managing a market economy that had no rival, that we were the best. I think that, in my view, the military limits that we continue today, both in Afghanistan and Iraq, raise questions about America's ability to tackle and handle other military issues today. So the real cost of Afghanistan is it ties us down so much that it makes us less compelling to Iran, North Korea, or other places with that. So the cost is one of enormous distraction, and the calculation that other players are making, that no matter what you may hear the president say, the wherewithal doesn't exist. So there's been a shattering of America's military mystique. Morally, I would say that particularly within the area of the world we're talking about, which is the Arab-Muslim world, or the Muslim South Asia, North Africa, this arc of instability, however you define it, is that Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, domestic spying, the United States was in many ways the beacon on the hill that many of them looked up to. When we began to engage in dismantling key parts of our own civil society infrastructure, I think we undermined our moral leadership in the world. It's the third area that we're going. We became much more regular, like a lot of other countries. And in the fourth, in ideas and institutions, we have a world today where countries like Brazil and Turkey, South Africa, I would argue Iran, and others see themselves as being able to take advantage and to move their agendas, to fill voids they see in areas the United States used to play, but the infrastructure of America's operations not operating well, not filling all these spaces. And so they, in the, I won't call it wreckage, but at least in the decline, or at least the poor management of this infrastructure that the United States had largely built out to confront the Soviet Union and the Soviet Empire, has created an opportunity for other players to come along, and in that, the ideas and institutions we have, the institutions of the UN and various, don't reflect the way power is really doled out today. And we have a difficult time, we've had a difficult time figuring out how to move forward. We've done a little bit in creating and putting emphasis on the G20. Barack Obama has tried to demonstrate leadership, and I think quite admirably, in nuclear and WMD control, and the nuclear summit he held here to try and restore a sense of global commons about many of these issues and to come forward. But fundamentally, I think we had seen real deterioration in America being seen as the institution whose global governance and role in that mattered at the edge. I've just spent 3 or 4 months mostly in China. And if you spend time in Beijing, you feel global gravity changing. Again, you see nations, finance ministers, foreign ministers, heads of state chasing the Chinese and China much more actively than you see happening in the United States. It's not that the United States isn't important or doesn't have great capacity. It's that at the edge of change, China today is having more of an impact than we are. And that brings me to the question again of costs. It seems to me that one of the challenges the U.S. has to deal with, if it were to take in, I'm a national security realist. I would like to see the United States regain power. I'd like to see it put its thumb on issues and demonstrate its ability to move the Israeli-Palestinian case forward. To me, it's a low-hanging fruit. It's one of the most doable deals out there in the world. Everyone knows what the deals are. If you had the political will, you read Bob Hunter's book. I'd put French troops maybe rather than U.S. troops. You can deal. But it has Israel, Palestine, I would argue in softer ways, Cuba, Syria, some other questions. If you can change the way gravity works around these issues, you get a larger echo effect and a larger impact on the international system than their populations or their geographic size. They are issues that have been insoluble, that if the president could pull off a Richard Nixon, could demonstrate an ability to reverse the global doubt that exists about America's ability to change these issues, you would fundamentally change the equation, because you'd begin to see a momentum develop and an opportunity begin taking on other issues. I think that what's happened, interesting politically, in both the Democratic and Republican parties, has been the rise of a view that America can just assert its positions on democracy or human rights or this or that with very little regard to how you actually do it, or what resources to get deployed and what we should expect back for those. We've entered in a period which is both driven by, I think, well-meaning, but much more emotional and much more, I would call, the soft side of foreign policy. The problem is, many of these goals and objectives are perfectly legitimate and things that we should, as a nation like the United States, try and achieve and do. The problem is we lack the power and political stock to do so. So you've got to reacquire power. You've got to reacquire the sense that there's leverage to come forward. And we're not doing that today in Afghanistan. In my view, we could do it in Israel-Palestine. We could do it by changing and ending the Cold War in Latin America with Cuba. It makes no sense today. I tell people that, it used to be that communist countries, and they still do, were the ones that would restrict the rights and ability of people to travel outside their country or even within their country. Today, the United States will not allow you students to go to Cuba unless you're a journalist or you're under special classification or you get a license. And that in my view, when you've seen what's happened with China, Vietnam, our relationship with Cuba makes absolutely no sense. But Cuba, to me, doesn't matter. I don't care about Cuba. I mean, I hate to sound so immoral. It's not about the Cubans I care about, or even this. I care about the fact that I want the United States to demonstrate an ability to change the way something operates. And frankly, people-to-people exchanges and whatnot, and demonstrating an ability to change something that's fundamentally irrational, actually would redound very positively to the United States, even though it's so low-hanging fruit. America has got to get out of the game where the way in which it most affects the globe today is through debt and the Pentagon. The Pentagon and the way we think about military power is not delivering. It doesn't make sense that the United States spends more money on its defense and security than all other nations in the world, and yet we don't feel secure. That's a management problem. There's a deliverables problem on that. And our size of our debt, while I tend to think that it's manageable and can be brought down, nonetheless is the way in which we affect global decisions more through our debt patterns than we do through our patterns of innovation, investment, and recreation. And so that is the cycle we need to get out of. And when I look at something like Afghanistan, which I've drilled into a bit, or some of the other issues I care about, these are manifestations of a problem that I think is rather important. And I'm hoping, I had hoped that President Obama, in concert with whether it was Democrats or not, because I'm not a Democrat, as you heard, I used to run the Nixon Center. I worked for Jeff Bingham, and I've worked on both sides of the aisle. I'm a ruthless pragmatist. I would like to see pragmatists come in and get into a problem-solving mode and begin thinking about the sorts of opportunities that one can do to change the way these gravitational forces work in the world. That would be an investment well worth it. Thank you.
Now we open it to you. Heidi, are you going to manage this question Q&A, or? All right, well, this gentleman here in front, I'll take the first choice, and you two take the next choice. Could you tell us who you are? That helps.
My name is Sarge Cheever. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer. And this is a question really, I guess, for Matthew. Whither General Petraeus in Afghanistan and our counterinsurgency efforts there? Is it going to be successful?
No.
No pussyfoot.
Yeah, no, it won't. I had just heard this, gosh, I go to so many different things or hear different people speak, and I don't know who to credit for this, but he was the best. I think it was General Paul Eaton said it. Last night, yeah. He was the best choice and the worst choice for the job. I think with General Petraeus, this is a personal thing for him. And if this is one of those things, kind of like I was talking about before, where the reality of what we do does not boil down to quantitative models. It boils down to people and relationships. And when you have a man who is in charge of your military campaign, who is the greatest American general in living memory, who will not satisfy with being Westmoreland, wants to be an Eisenhower, who knew from day one at West Point that he wanted to be Chief of Staff of the Army or Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, it's a very personal thing for him. So I don't believe that the counterinsurgency will work there. There are just a number of different factors why I believe that. What I think will happen, though, however, on the political level, is that the Obama administration will continue this through at least the 2012 election. And again, because General Petraeus is a personal thing for him. There are others at senior levels. I believe Admiral Mullen, Secretary Gates, Secretary Clinton, who believe it is possible to do this. And most importantly, whereas Steve was talking about the polling data that we have on a number of people who in the U.S. who are against the war, or don't think it's working, or think it's not worth it, or we should do something different, very few of those people will vote on it. We had 2% of the American public after the midterm elections said that Afghanistan should be a priority for the 112th Congress. So I think there is no reason why the Obama administration politically does anything different before the 2012 election. Why bring this up as something for the Republicans to fight him on? I can't think of any potential Republican frontrunners, excluding Ron Paul, and he's not a frontrunner, who will run against the president on Afghanistan. So whether or not counterinsurgency is working, is kind of a moot point because it's up to the president, and he's already in his presidential campaign cycle. And I think that's the most important thing affecting our decisions in Afghanistan.
Thank you. My name is Firdaus Baga. I'm a grad student at American University studying peace and conflict resolution. And Ambassador Hunter, you mentioned earlier that we need to address negotiations with Iran before a lot of other things can be accomplished. I was wondering what you all would recommend to change with negotiations with Iran, and what can be done, and do you see anything changing in the near future, or is there any hope for that?
Well, what I would do, and I'll ask my colleagues to comment on this, is to offer security for security. That if Iran would be prepared to meet our concerns and concerns of others, including Israel, which have to do with full inspection of everything they're doing in the nuclear area to make sure they are not going in a weapons direction, which would include changing its relationship with Hezbollah and Hamas and abandoning any support for terrorism. And I could put some other things on that list. We would be prepared to say to the Iranians, we understand that you have legitimate security concerns. One, the constant comment about all options remain on the table. Secondly, threats that we and others make about potentially having a conflict with Iran. And the fact that we have them surrounded with U.S. forces on two sides, and they also face a number of hostile nuclear powers, that we would be willing to engage in a discussion about a framework in which its legitimate security concerns would be taken into account, as we have with other countries, as we did with the Soviet Union and they with us. We won't do that. And frankly, unless we're prepared to do that, I think negotiations with Iran have zero chance of succeeding. Now, if we made that offer, and if they pushed it aside, we'd be in a much better situation to go to the Europeans and others and talk about sanctions and the like. What I worry about is we'll get ourselves in a circumstance in which we may engage in military action or countenance or not be able to stop Israel from engaging in military action. And we would then find that the invasion of Iraq was a picnic in comparison. Mm-hmm. The consequences, that would be horrendous. Every single one of our allies say this. It could lead to the destruction of the NATO alliance and other things. Now, having Iran with the bomb, which is, I think, the direction the administration is probably going in, if it cannot find a way to deflect Iran from that, is something I wouldn't want to live with. It would impose huge costs on us in terms of continuing our strategic engagement. Frankly, I think the Iranians would be nuts to do it. It would be an incredible white elephant for them. Gaddafi was smart enough to recognize that giving up the potential for the bomb would succeed for Libya, and it did. But we're not prepared to consider these alternatives, and I think we're painting ourselves into a corner. I don't love what the Iranians are doing. I don't think I don't happen to like the regime there, but we have prevented ourselves from having a dialogue on what might happen with regard to Afghanistan, their help in Afghanistan, and that's leading to more people dying. This quality of being mesmerized with them and they're being mesmerized with us, frankly, is not helping anybody, and it's time the president took the lead and got us off that particular course. Now, I'd welcome what my two colleagues say, because what I just said is very unpopular, but the course we're on right now, I think, is leading potentially to disaster.
I largely agree with Bob, with the exception that I think that deal would have been much easier to do in 2003. In fact, it was on the table. They offered the deal. There was a deal which the United States failed to respond to, that put their security concerns and what they saw as our security concerns on the table. It was very comprehensive, offered secretly, and we did nothing with it. But we had just invaded Iraq, and there was a sense of great insecurity inside Iran. I think what's happened now, if you listen to the things I help share, is that Iran sees its own situation as enhanced. And to get, while I completely agree with what might be a very smart strategy for the United States, the question is not that I want Iran to walk away from it. I would like to see Iran have some sort of crisis of confidence, or for us to get lucky on something and get, Israel-Palestine moved in a better track, or to do something to demonstrate that we're back in the game of shaping in very positive and constructive ways the international system, and that the global doubt about America's ability to achieve its objectives has been reversed.
I would say
We have to accept Iran will be a nuclear power. And whether it occurs 5 years or 15 years, I don't know, because I can't keep track of all the different estimates that keep getting leaked out. But we have to accept that, and we have to plan for it and prepare for that. And the Iranians know we're tough. We removed both regimes next door to them in Kabul and in Baghdad in a matter of weeks. And we could remove the regime from power in Tehran in a matter of weeks if we wanted to again. What we do with it after the next several years, God knows. But if we want to remove the regime from power in Iran, we can. And they know that. What we have to do is we have to engage the Iranian people now. Because 15 years from now, your counterpart who's studying in grad school at the University of Tehran or whatever American university's counterpart is, or sister college, and is every time she turns on the television and satellite news, she gets another American politician talking about how we have to bomb their country. Okay, and that's what she's growing up with. Okay, she might be trying to find American television programming. She might be trying to watch Dancing with the Stars, okay, or episode of Sopranos or something like that. But while flipping through those channels, she gets Lindsey Graham talking about how we need to have permanent bases in Afghanistan in order to contain or attack Iran. The other thing is we have to establish our moral authority along the lines of we cannot criticize the Iranians for having fraudulent elections. And I phrase that wrong because we should. If they have fraudulent elections, we should criticize them for it. But we can't do that in 1 month and then see the next country over, Afghanistan, their regime steal their elections, and we send them 30,000 more troops. Okay, because we're destroying our moral authority, we're destroying our credibility. Other nations around the world, a lot of times when I talk to students, I say, I think the hardest job in the world is being a desk officer for the United States in someone else's foreign ministry. Could you imagine having to assess what the United States is doing in foreign policy and then predict where it's going to go in 5 or 10 years so that you can shape your own policy to engage with them? We're irrational. We're not dependable. Schizophrenic might be a term we can be used for our foreign policy, particularly over the last decade. So we need to really think about how are we going to engage these nations 5, 10, 15 years from now? How are you going to engage your counterparts 15, 20 years from now when they've been brought up in an era where every time they turned on the television, there's another American politician saying the best course of action is to bomb their country, let alone the fact that we're removed from power. If I was the Iranians, I'd want the bomb too. I mean, then we have to accept that, and we have to work through that. I don't think it's the best thing in the world, but it's the reality. So.
Well, the good news is that the United States is more popular in Iran with the people than any other country in the Middle East.
And just for the record, I disagree with Matt.
Okay, we've run out of time.
With that, our program concludes. Please join me in thanking our speakers, and our speakers will be able to continue to speak with them at the reception afterwards. On behalf of the council, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bob.
You're great. Thank you. Thanks for what you do.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.